All right, let's go. Number 10. The boomerang carved from a mammoth's tusk. In 1985, an archaeologist named Pavel Nowak began excavating a small cave in the Polish Carpathians, in a limestone crag above the Białka River. The site is called Oblazawa. It is not impressive from the outside. The chamber is shallow, the deposits are thin, and the work would run on for the better part of a decade. In the layer cataloged as Level 8, his team lifted out a curved object 72 centimeters long. It was flattened along its length, slightly asymmetrical, and worked to a smooth finish. It was not made of wood. It had been cut from a mammoth tusk and ground down until fine parallel striations ran the length of both faces. That is the first thing worth sitting with. Wood was available. Wood is light. It grows everywhere, and it is far easier to shape. Ivory is dense and heavy. It has to be worked wet, or it checks and cracks, and it splits along the grain when the material is read wrong. Somebody took the hardest workable substance in that landscape and spent an enormous amount of time turning it into a throwing weapon. The second thing is that it does not come back. Replica testing confirmed what the profile already suggested. This is a non-returning boomerang, which is the older and far more common form of the weapon, and the form actually used for killing. A returning boomerang is a specialist instrument for driving birds toward a net. A non-returning one is a heavy, flat, fast projectile that travels in a straight line and breaks legs. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because the returning kind is the one everybody pictures, and it is the rarer and the later of the two. This object belongs to the working family. The surface tells us the rest. It carries the polish of repeated handling, and the shaping is consistent with a right-handed thrower. This was not made and admired. Somebody used it. Then there is the age, and the age has moved. In 2025, a team led by Sahara Talamo published a new chronology for the cave in the journal Plois 1, built on fresh radiocarbon dates and a Bayesian model of the whole sequence. The boomerang falls between roughly 42,000 and 39,000 years ago. That places it among the oldest objects of its kind found anywhere. At the far edge of the period when modern humans were spreading into Central Europe. But here is where the layer stops looking like a hunting deposit and starts looking like something else. Level 8 did not contain only the boomerang. It contained a human finger bone, the end of a left thumb identified as Homo sapiens. It contained a conus shell, polished and deliberately incised, carried an extraordinary distance from any sea. It contained a bone bead, 2 pendants cut from the canine teeth of Arctic foxes' antler wedges, and a deliberate arrangement of stones around a pit. That is not a discarded kit. That is a deposit. The excavators are careful about the finger. Its chemical preservation fell outside the range that allows a reliable date, so its own age can only be read as a minimum. The association in the ground is real. The reason behind it is not recoverable. So, what survives is a working weapon and a set of facts that refuse to resolve into a story. Ivory chosen over wood, a flight path that goes out and does not return. A human thumb, a seashell in the mountains, and fox teeth drilled for a cord. It is a haunting inventory, and nobody has explained it. The boomerang itself is intact. We can measure its curve model, its flight, and read the handling wear along both faces. What nobody can recover is why a weapon somebody used and a piece of somebody's hand went into the same hole in the ground. Number 9. The Volgu blades. Start with the object because the numbers are the argument. The largest one is 35 centimeters long. It is between 7 and 12 millimeters thick. It is made of flint worked on both faces, and it tapers to a point at each end in a shape archaeologists call a laurel leaf. Hold that proportion in mind. It is roughly the length of a forearm and about the thickness of a phone, and every millimeter of that surface was removed by hand. There are at least 15 of them. They were found in the early 1870s at a place called Volgu in Saône-et-Loire in eastern France. Buried together under about a meter of sediment and published in 1874, several disappeared before anyone recorded them properly. 13 are now in the Musée Vivant de Nantes in Chalon-sur-Saône. They belong to the Solutrean. the culture that produced the finest stoneworking of the European Ice Age, roughly 25 to 21,000 years ago. Solutrean knappers used pressure flaking. Instead of striking the stone, the worker presses a pointed tool of antler or bone against the edge until a flake releases, which trades force for control and allows a blade to be thinned in stages rather than in one blow. The intact Volgu pieces run between 23 and 34 centimeters long and weigh between 128 and 181 grams. These blades went past the place where the craft stops being useful, and two recent studies show exactly how far. In 2018, Patrick Schmidt, Ludovic Bello-Gerlet, and Harold Floss tested 7 of the pieces by infrared spectroscopy for signs of heat treatment. Heating flint before knapping changes its structure and makes it easier to work, and it had long been assumed that objects this thin required it. None of the 7 showed any heat treatment signature at all. They were made the hard way. Then, in 2022, Sebastian Koch and Patrick Schmidt matched the raw material itself. Every piece they analyzed came from flint sources in the southeastern Paris basin between 170 and 250 kilometers away. So the sequence runs like this. Somebody walked 200 kilometers for the stone. They rejected the shortcut that would have made it easier to work, and then they thinned each nodule down to under a centimeter across a 30-centimeter span, knowing that a single misplaced flake ends the object, which raises the obvious question about what these were for. Here the honest answer is that nobody has published a use-where study of the Volgu pieces, so any statement about function is interpretation rather than evidence. What can be said is that no obvious traces of use have been reported on them, that the edges are too thin to resharpen, and that functional Solutrean laurel leaves are generally under 15 centimeters. These are 2 and 3 times that size. A working spear point does not need to be a forearm long, and it does not benefit from being thin enough to snap under its own weight. The reasonable reading is that these are weapons in form and something else in purpose. Objects that borrow the outline of a hunting point and push it into a register where the outline is the whole message. Skill made visible. Value made portable. Then they were buried together deliberately as a group and left. What survives at Chalon-sur-Saône is 13 pieces of flint that display more control than almost anything else we have from Ice Age Europe. What did not survive is whatever the display was for. Somebody carried the stone 200 kilometers, spent an unrecoverable number of hours on each blade, and then put the whole set in the ground. The craft is completely legible. The meaning is completely gone, and that is the unsettling half of the object. Number 8. The oldest hafted spear tip. In 2012, Jane Wilkins, then at the University of Toronto, published a result in the journal Science that pushed a piece of human technology back by roughly 200,000 years. Her team was working with material from Katupan, a site in the northern Cape of South Africa. The relevant layer stratum 4A has been dated by 2 independent methods. Optically stimulated luminescence returned about 460,000 years. Uranium series and electron spin resonance on the tooth of an extinct horse returned a figure above 500,000. Both carry large uncertainties, and the people who produced them said so plainly. Together they placed the deposit somewhere around 500,000 years old, which is long before our own species existed anywhere. The layer contained stone points. Wilkins and her colleagues examined 210 of them. The claim rests on damage. When a stone point is driven into an animal at speed, it fails in a particular way, and the fracture that results is different from the damage a cutting tool picks up. 29 of the 210 pieces, just under 14%, carried that kind of fracture. The edge damage clustered at the tips rather than along the sides. About 13% showed modification at the base of the kind made to seat a point in a shaft. The team tested their criteria against points fired from a calibrated crossbow and against unused flakes where the same damage appeared on fewer than 2%. The problem is that fracture patterns are exactly the kind of evidence other specialists spend careers taking apart. In 2014, Verlerotz and Hugues Plisson published a direct challenge. Their argument was technical and specific. The fractures at Kathupan, they said, do not begin the way genuine impact fractures begin, and they carry features pointing to ordinary napping instead. One fracture type is not enough to diagnose a weapon. Basal modification can be explained without a haft. Wilkins and her colleagues replied the following year and did not concede. In 2016, they went further and modeled the assemblage as roughly half spear damage and half natural post-burial damage, arguing that the second could not produce the pattern on its own. That argument has not been settled. It is still live. Strip the dispute back, though, and something underneath it is not in doubt at all, and it is the reason this entry is here. A hafted point is not a sharper rock. It is an assembly. It requires a stone component, made to a shape, a wooden shaft prepared separately, an adhesive to bond the two, and usually a binding of sinew or plant fiber to hold the joint under load. Each part is made by a different process, on a different timescale, from a different material. None of them works alone. Later recipes make the demand clearer still. The glues that survive elsewhere in Africa are compound mixtures resin combined with ochre or beeswax to control brittleness, heated to a working consistency, and then given exactly one chance to set before the joint is loaded. The person building that object has to hold the finished weapon in mind while making a component that does nothing by itself. That is the beginning of every composite technology that follows, including all of ours. Every arrow, every axe, every machine assembled from parts that are useless in isolation descends from that idea. And the disturbing thing about Kathupan is not the date. It is the scale of what rests on it. An entire 200,000-year revision to the story of human technology hangs on scars a few millimeters across, on 29 pieces of stone in a quarry deposit in the Northern Cape. This entry opened with the oldest weapon of its kind. What the site actually offers is thinner and stranger than that. 210 stone points. A careful disagreement about what happened to 29 of them, and no shaft, no glue, and no binding anywhere in the deposit, because none of those things last 500,000 years. Number 7, the spearthrower. In 1986, in a cave in the Dordogne called Combe-Saunière, on an excavation directed by Jean-Michel Geneste, 2 fragments of worked reindeer antler came out of the same square meter of deposit. One was recorded in place. The other turned up in the screening. They refit. The reassembled object is small. It survives to 50.5 millimeters long, 7.5 millimeters wide, and just over 9 millimeters high, and it ends in a hook. Pierre Catalan published it in 1989. It came from a level dated between roughly 19 and 17,000 years ago, and it is the oldest object anywhere that can be identified with confidence as part of a spear thrower. A spear thrower is not a sharpened thing. It is a machine. The principle is a lever. The thrower holds a rigid shaft about 0.5 meter long with a hook or a spur at the far end, and the butt of a light spear sits against that hook. When the arm comes forward, the wrist rotates and the device swings through an arc. So the hook travels much further and much faster than the hand holding it. The spear leaves at the speed of the hook, not the speed of the hand. John Whitaker, who has spent decades studying these weapons and throwing them, is blunt about the mechanism. Levers, he says, not springs. And then somebody measured how much difference it actually makes at a scale that settles the question. In 2023, Michelle Beber and colleagues published an experiment in Scientific Reports involving 108 participants and 2,160 recorded launches. Hand-thrown javelins left at a mean of 9.8 meters per second. The same people using the spear thrower and dart averaged 16.2. That is roughly 65% faster from the same arms on the same afternoon. A separate study of 414 throws by experienced atlatlists measured with radar put typical dart speeds around 22 meters per second, with the best throws reaching the mid-30s. The claim that a spear thrower triples projectile speed circulates constantly. It does not, and careful measurement has said so for years. What the device really does is more interesting than the exaggeration. The Beber study found something else in its data. In the hand-thrown javelin, trials men threw significantly faster than women, which is the expected result. In the spearthrower trials, that difference did not hold. Once the lever is doing the work, raw throwing power stops being the limiting factor, and timing takes its place. Consider what that means for a band of 40 people at the edge of an ice sheet. A hand-thrown spear is a weapon for whoever has the shoulders for it, which in any group is a minority. A spear thrower is a weapon for almost anyone who can learn the release. It does not make one hunter better. It changes how many people in a camp can hunt at all, and that is a change in the size of the workforce rather than the quality of the tool. The rest of the record fits an object that mattered. Roughly 115 Paleolithic spear throwers are known to us in total, which is an extraordinary scarcity for a weapon that was clearly in wide use. That scarcity is a preservation accident. Antler survives, and wood does not. So what reaches a museum is almost always the hook, and almost never the half-meter shaft it was fitted to. The earliest ones, including the comb saunière hook, are plain splinters with a scraped notch. The famous carved examples, with their bison and their leaping fawns and their mammoths, come later. First the machine worked, then it was worth decorating. And the design never disappeared. Spanish soldiers met the atlotl in the hands of Aztec armies in the 16th century, and it was still killing them. In Australia, the woomera is still made and still used. In the United States and Europe, people compete with these weapons, now on measured ranges, with radar guns pointed down the line at a technology from the last ice age. A hooked splinter of reindeer antler 5 centimeters long from a cave in the Dordogne. It is the oldest surviving piece of a machine that human beings never stopped throwing. Number 6. The quiver that was not ready. The quiver is a tube of deer hide about 90 centimeters long, stiffened along one side by a hazel rod cut to roughly the same length. Inside it were 14 arrows. 2 of them could be shot. The other 12 could not. The 2 finished arrows had flint points and fletching. The 12 unfinished ones were shafts of wayfaring tree wood, 84 to 87 centimeters long, stripped of bark but not smoothed, with no point and no feathers. Alongside the quiver lay a bow of yew, 1 meter 82 longer than the man carrying it, and not finished either. The stave still needed rubbing down. A separate bundle held 2 meters of cord, twisted from 3 strands of animal sinew about 4 millimeters thick. It is the oldest bowstring known to us, and on the day it went into the ice, it was not on the bow. The man is the Iceman found in the Ötztal Alps, dead for about 5,300 years. His kit is the most complete Stone Age weapon set that exists. The interest of it is not that it is old. It is that we can read the level of specification. The fletching on the finished arrows is 3 split feather halves set around the shaft, fixed with birch tar and bound with thread of nettle fiber. That is the earliest surviving fletching in the world, and the arrangement is essentially the one archers use today. One arrow has a shaft in 2 parts with a short foreshaft of dogwood socketed into the main shaft. That is the earliest known example of the design, and its logic is economic. A foreshaft absorbs the impact and the breakage, and it can be replaced without rebuilding the arrow. The rest of the equipment is the same story. A copper axe, the blade cast at 99.7% purity on a U-haft, about 60 centimeters long, bound with birch tar and leather. A small flint dagger with an ash handle carried in a woven sheath of lime bast. And a stick of lime wood, 12 centimeters long, sharpened like a pencil with a hard antler point driven into the core. That last object is a retoucher. It presses flakes off a flint edge to bring it back to sharpness in the field. None of this is improvisation. This is a tradesman's role, except that almost none of it was ready to use. 12 blank shafts, an unfinished bow, a bowstring still in its bundle. Whatever he was doing in that pass, he was doing it while his principal weapon lay in pieces. In 2001, a radiologist in Bolzano named Paul Gosner found something on a scan that more than 100 previous examinations had missed. A flint arrowhead lodged in the left shoulder, entering from behind and below. He had been shot from the rear. For nearly 20 years, the standard reading published in 2007 was that the arrow tore the artery beneath the collarbone and killed him quickly. In November 2025, a team at Urec Research in Bolzano published a clinical reassessment and reached a different conclusion. The wound track runs 11 to 13 centimeters, mostly through muscle, at a shallow upward angle, and the point came to rest about a centimeter from the major vessels, rather than through them. Their reading is that he did not bleed out fast. He may have lasted hours. That change is more haunting than it sounds. It moves the death from an execution to something slower and far less certain on a saddle at 3,000 meters in the cold. There is one more injury. A deep cut at the base of his right thumb down to the bone unhealed and several days old when he died. Something had already happened to him before the arrow. The bow is now in a museum case in Bolzano, still unfinished. Still too long for him, the last piece of work he did not get to complete. One more thing about that morning has never been explained. The copper axe alone was worth more than anything else on that mountain, and it was lying beside the body when the ice gave him back. Number 5. The point designed to fail. The Clovis point is the most recognizable stone artifact in North America. It is a lance-shaped blade, usually 5 to 12 centimeters long, made across the continent around 13,000 years ago. And it has one feature nobody has convincingly explained. A long channel flake was struck from the base of each face, leaving a groove that runs up a third of the blade. Archaeologists call it the flute. Fluting is a terrible idea. It removes material from the strongest part of the point. Worse, the flake that produces it can shatter the whole piece at the last stage of manufacture after every other hour of work is already invested. Modern knappers who reproduce the technique lose a share of their pieces at exactly that moment. Archaeologists have argued about why anyone would accept that risk since the points were first recognized in the 1930s. The usual answers are that the flute improves hafting or that it helps the wound bleed. Neither has ever fully satisfied anyone. In August 2024, 3 researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published a proposal in PLOS 1 that starts from a different question. Scott Byram, Kent Lightfoot, and Junweno Sunseri asked what happens if a Clovis point was not primarily thrown or thrust at all. Their model is a braced pike. The butt of the shaft is planted in the ground, the point is angled, and the weapon is never driven into the animal. The animal drives itself onto the weapon. This is not an exotic idea. It is how people have taken bear's boar and big cats with fixed spears across several continents and several centuries. It is also the only realistic way for someone on foot to face something mammoth-sized and survive it. Set the weapon up that way, and the numbers change completely. The Berkeley team built a drop tower and measured what a braced Clovis assembly does under compression. A sharp point needs only 4 to 8 joules to break through hide. The lashings holding the point to its foreshaft rupture somewhere between 27 and 62 joules, with failures clustering around 39 and 49. Above roughly 62 joules, the stone itself begins to crush. A charging animal delivers far more energy than any of those thresholds. The arithmetic is not close. A large animal at a run carries kinetic energy in the thousands of joules, and a mammoth-sized one carries far more than that. Something in the assembly is going to break every single time, and the only question a designer can answer is, which part? What makes this design intelligent is what it does with that excess. The foreshaft is a beveled rod of bone or ivory, and under compression it collapses in a controlled way. The stone point recedes into the wound rather than taking the full load and exploding while the heavier wooden shaft keeps driving forward behind it. The bone rod may then rotate outward inside the animal, opening the wound further as it goes. That is a controlled failure. The expensive part gives way last, and the cheap part gives way first, which is the same principle that puts a fuse in a circuit. Read as a hand weapon, the flute is a manufacturing risk with no obvious payoff. Read as part of a brace system, it is a seat. A thinned base that lets the point slide back into a collapsing foreshaft instead of shattering against bone. The authors are careful about their limits, and they should be. Their tests were static and along a single axis. They did not model an animal moving, changing direction, or striking the shaft at an angle. They say so directly. This is a hypothesis with real force behind it, not a settled result, and the fluting argument has swallowed better ideas before, but it reframes the object. The brutal arithmetic of hunting an animal 4 tons heavier than the hunter is that no human arm can generate enough force to matter. The only force available is the animal's own, and the only way to use it is to stand still and let it arrive. Ask a modern hunter of dangerous game about a braced spear, and the answer matches the archaeology exactly. The crossbar welded onto a boar spear exists because the animal keeps coming after the blade is already in it. 13,000 years later, the physics of holding ground against something that outweighs a person several times over has not moved at all. Number 4. The machine that left no trace. Consider the awkward shape of this problem before the evidence arrives. The bow is the most consequential weapon of the Stone Age. It made killing possible at distance from cover, silently and repeatedly. It reorganized hunting, and eventually it reorganized war. And there is no bow anywhere on Earth older than about 11,000 years. A bow is wood, and sinew and gut. Those things rot. So the entire early history of the weapon has to be reconstructed from the only part that reaches us: the tip. The strongest case comes from Sibudu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The relevant layers have been dated by luminescence to between roughly 61 and 65,000 years ago. What they contain are small-backed pieces of quartz, and small is the point. One illustrated example measures 12 millimeters by 8. Marlise Lombard examined the residues on them and found something specific about how they had been mounted. The plant gum used as adhesive is concentrated from the middle of the piece toward the blunt edge, and the resin preserves the imprint of plant cells from the binding. That pattern means the stone was glued sideways with a cutting edge facing forward, rather than pointed forward like a spear tip. A stone edge mounted sideways is useless on any weapon driven by the arm alone. It only makes sense as a light-cutting head on a small, fast projectile. In 2018, a team including Lucinda Backwell and Francesco D'Erico published a bone point from the same cave and roughly the same age. It is 49 millimeters long, 5.5 wide, and it carries impact fractures with internal microcracks confirmed by high-resolution scanning. A comparable point came from Clovis River on the southern coast, with adhesive residue and hafting traces within 9 millimeters of the base. But here is where the specialists put a limit on their own conclusion, and the limit is worth hearing. The team working on the Clovis River point stated plainly that no published method reliably separates a hand-thrown javelin tip from an arrowhead. That is the honest and slightly unsettling boundary of this field. Everything before 11,000 years ago is an argument from size mounting and damage, not a bow in a case. There is a second argument, and it works on the whole assembly rather than the tip. A bow is not one invention. It is at least 6 and an elastic stave chosen from the right wood, a string that will not stretch a light shaft, a tip, an adhesive, and a binding. Everyone has to be developed separately, and none of them does anything on its own. The stone we recover is the last and smallest component of a system, and it is the only component that fossilizes. The argument now runs across several continents. In Sri Lanka, at a cave called Fahian Lena, Michelle Langley and colleagues published 130 bone points in 2020, the earliest, around 48,000 years old, from a rainforest where the prey was monkeys and squirrels. Other researchers replied that those points could equally tip a multi-pronged fishing spear. At Grotta Mandrin in France, flint points weighing only a few grams have been argued as evidence for archery in Europe 54,000 years ago. And the objects everyone actually wants are almost entirely gone. The oldest surviving arrows come from Stellmore near Hamburg. Alfred Rust excavated more than 100 pine shafts there in the mid-1930s, complete with the notches that seat them against a string. Almost all of them burned in an air raid on Kiel in May 1944. That loss is its own extraordinary detail. A set of Ice Age arrows that had lasted 11,000 years in waterlogged ground was destroyed in a single night by a 20th century war. Two fragments turned up again in Rust's papers in 2013 and were dated to a little under 12,000 years. The oldest complete bows cut from elm come from a Danish bog at Holmegard and are about 9,000 years old. That is the entire physical record of the most important weapon in prehistory. 100 burnt arrows, 2 survivors in an envelope, and some bog-stained elm in Copenhagen. The gap is not really the problem. It is what the gap conceals. If the Sibudu reading is right, the bow existed for 50,000 years before anything we can hold in a hand. The weapon that most changed what human beings could do to each other and to everything else alive is almost entirely invisible in the ground. We know it by the size of the stones it left behind. Number 3, the poison. In 2026, a team led by Sven Isaksson at Stockholm University working with Marlies Lombard and Anders Hagberg published a result in Science Advances that closed an argument running for decades. They took 10 small quartz tools from Umlatuzana Rock Shelter in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and ran them through gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. 5 came back carrying bufanidrin and epibufenicine. Those are alkaloids, and they come from one plant, Buphone distiga, a bulb known locally as the poison onion. The deposits are about 60,000 years old. That is the oldest direct chemical evidence of arrow poison anywhere on Earth. The reason it took so long is that the molecules were assumed not to last. To check, the team ran the same analysis on historic arrowheads about 250 years old in Swedish collections and found the same compounds sitting on them. The method passed its own test first, which changes how the arrowheads themselves have to be read. Stone Age projectile tips get smaller over time, and the trend has been measured precisely. A small tip does not kill a large animal. A point a centimeter across opens a wound most big game will walk away from. Comparison with recorded hunting shows that the smallest tips of all belong consistently to poisoned arrows. At that size, the arrow has stopped being the weapon. It is the delivery system. For years before the chemistry caught up, the archaeology of poison was a chain of near misses. In 2012, Francesco De Rico, Lucinda Backwell, and colleagues published a thin wooden stick from the Border Cave in South Africa about 24,000 years old, carrying residues of ricinoleic acid from the castor bean. They rate it as a poison applicator. An objection appeared in the same journal within months. Ricinoleic acid is the main component of castor oil, and castor oil has medicinal and cosmetic uses. The authors replied that a stick of that shape in that place is hard to read any other way. Both arguments were reasonable. Neither could win. What makes the next find different is that it arrived with a recipe. In 2024, Justin Bradfield, Ian Dubarry, and Paul Steenkamp at the University of Johannesburg published the analysis of a bone that had sat in a university department for about 40 years. It is an antelope femur from Kruger Cave in the Magaliesberg, roughly 7,000 years old, with 3 bone arrowheads pushed inside the marrow cavity. The cavity had worked as a sealed container. The residue inside it held digitoxin and strophanthinidin, both cardiac glycosides and ricinoleic acid again. Digitoxin and strophanthinidin come from different plants. This is not one crushed leaf. It is a mixture, and the species that produce those compounds do not grow anywhere near that cave. Somebody either traveled a long way for the ingredients or got them from people who had. What these chemicals do is worth stating plainly, because it explains the patience the whole system demands. Cardiac glycosides jam the ion pump every heart cell uses to reset itself. Calcium builds up inside the muscle. The rhythm degrades, and the heart falls into an arrhythmia it cannot recover from. Ricin works differently and slower, shutting down protein manufacture inside cells so completely that death follows even at high doses, only after many hours. Neither is fast. In southern African hunting recorded in the 20th century, a large animal hit with a poisoned arrow may take 12 to 15 hours to go down, and hunters have often tracked it for days and finished it with a spear. So the weapon is not really the arrow. It is the arrow plus a compound drawn from one plant, plus the knowledge of which plant plus a mixture that beats any single ingredient. And then 2 days of tracking on the strength of a shot that did nothing visible at the time. That is the disturbing part of this entry, and it has nothing to do with cruelty. It is that the whole system only works if you can hold cause and effect together across a delay of days on nothing but confidence in the chemistry. The last piece of it is still in the pharmacy. Cardiac glycosides never left medicine. In a controlled dose, the same class of compound that stops a wounded antelope's heart is used to steady a failing human one. The plants have not changed. The molecules have not changed. The only difference between the two uses is the quantity and the intent, which is a terrifying thing to be able to say about a technology 60,000 years old. Number 2. The weapons that stayed in the bodies. In 1965, the Nile Valley in northern Sudan was about to disappear under the reservoir behind the Aswan High Dam, and archaeologists were working against the water. One of them was Fred Windorf. On a low sandstone rise near Jebel Sahaba on the east bank, he excavated a cemetery catalogued as Site 117 and recovered the remains of more than 60 people. They had been buried deliberately in graves in a defined burial ground. And among the bones were stone flakes that had no business being there. Windorf published his conclusion in 1968. This was the earliest known evidence of warfare, and the site has carried that description ever since. The collection went to the British Museum in 2001, and there it sat available to anyone with a microscope and a reason. In 2021, Isabelle Crèvecoeur, Daniel Antoine, and colleagues published a full microscopic reanalysis in Scientific Reports, working through every bone from 61 individuals. They identified more than 100 injuries nobody had recorded before. 62% of the people in that cemetery carried trauma of some kind. 11 of them still had stone fragments lodged inside their bones in marks made by projectiles, and 20 embedded pieces were counted in total. 13 of those had never been noticed. But here is the finding that changed what the cemetery means. Many of the injured carried healed wounds and unhealed wounds on the same skeleton. Old damage a body had recovered from and new damage from the day they died. That is not a battle. A battle happens once. Healed injuries mean these people were attacked, survived, went on living, and were attacked again. The pattern held across men, women, and children in roughly equal measure, which is not what a fight between warriors looks like. It is what raiding looks like carried out repeatedly across generations against a group that could not leave. The dating spans a wide range, somewhere between about 13 and 18,000 years ago, when the Nile corridor was the only dependable water in a drying and increasingly hostile landscape. Where would a family go in a valley, narrowing under drought with the desert on both sides of them? The disturbing detail is what the embedded fragments actually are. They are not finely crafted arrowheads. Many are ordinary, unretouched flakes set into shafts as barbs and lateral cutting edges alongside pieces worked to an oblique or transverse edge. The authors describe composite weapons built from several small stone inserts and note that the variety in size implies more than one kind of weapon, in use from light arrows to something considerably heavier. Think about what a row of loose flakes along a shaft is for. A single point makes a hole. A line of barbs makes a wound that cannot be drawn out cleanly, that tears on the way in, and that leaves pieces behind when the shaft is pulled or breaks. Some of those inserts were never retouched at all, which means they were expendable by design, struck fresh, and set into a shaft that nobody expected to get back. The design intent is not a clean kill. It is damage that stays. And that intent is the only reason we can see any of this. The weapons are visible to us because they were built to come apart inside a person, and they did. The same thing appears in East Africa. At Nataruk, on an old shoreline of Lake Turkana in Kenya, a team led by Marta Mirazon Lar published 27 individuals in 2016, around 10,000 years old, lying where they fell with no burial at all. One man's skull has an obsidian blade still in it. That find was challenged in print seriously and in detail, and the authors defended it at length. Even the critics accepted the blade in the skull. Obsidian is uncommon in that part of Turkana, which is a quiet way of saying the weapon may have come from somewhere else. The bodies from Jebel Sahaba are in London now, in drawers catalogued and measured to a standard Wendorf could not have achieved in 1965. The flakes are still inside some of them. Nobody knows what those people called themselves. Nobody knows what the fighting was about, or who won, or whether winning meant anything for longer than a season. What we are left with is a stone chip in a hip bone, a healed wound above it, and the brutal arithmetic that both of them belong to the same person. Number 1. The spears from the lignite mine. In 1994, on the floor of an open-cast brown coal mine at Schöningen in Lower Saxony, a team under Hartmut Team began digging along the edge of what had once been a lake. The excavation ran for 5 years. What came out of that shoreline is the oldest complete set of hunting weapons on Earth. 9 spears, a lance, 6 double-pointed sticks. Around them, more than 12,000 animal bones, and among those the remains of over 50 horses, many carrying cut marks. The wood should not exist. Organic material of that age is gone everywhere else we have looked. It survives here only because the lake margin sealed the objects into waterlogged sediment within days and kept the oxygen off them for the whole time since. The spears are between 1 meter 84 and 2 meters 53 long, and between 29 and 47 millimeters thick. Most are Norway spruce. One is pine. And they are not sharpened sticks. Start with where the weight sits. On at least some of the spears, the greatest diameter, and therefore the center of gravity lies in the front third of the shaft. That is the balance of a competition javelin, and it is what makes a thrown shaft fly nose first instead of tumbling. Then look at which part of the tree they used. The points were cut from the base of the trunk where the wood is densest. The shaft was worked so the soft pith at the center of the tree runs off to the side of the tip rather than straight through it. Somebody understood that a spruce is not uniform. They knew which part of one specific tree had to become the part that survives hitting bone. The wood was carried 3 to 5 kilometers to the lake. A study published in 2024 counted 187 worked wooden objects from the site, of which 20 to 25 are weapons, and about 35 are domestic tools for working hide. This was not improvisation on a shoreline. It was a workshop with a supply chain. In 2019, Ann Meeky Milks, David Parker, and Matt Pope tested what the design does. Replicas of Schöningen Spear 2 were made in Norwegian spruce, weighing 760 and 800 grams, and handed to 6 trained javelin athletes. The spears reached between 19 and 31 meters. Aimed throws hit targets at up to 20 meters, arriving at 13.5 to nearly 22 meters per second, and carrying between 71 and 179 joules. That forced a revision. The accepted effective range for these weapons had been 5 to 10 meters, essentially a thrusting distance. The measured figure is 15 to 20, which is the difference between standing beside a horse and standing well clear of it. 2 of the double-pointed sticks have been studied closely. One is spruce, 64.5 centimeters long, 264 grams, carrying impact fractures that match experimental throwing sticks. The second is 77 centimeters and about 140 grams, and its growth rings average 0.2 of a millimeter. The maker had chosen a tree that grew extremely slowly into extremely dense wood. The bark was cut away, the surface scraped the knots, worked down, flush, and both ends carved to a taper. Then, in May 2025, the age of all of it moved. For 30 years, these were the 400,000-year-old spears, later revised to around 300,000. A team including Gerard Hudson at the Leibniz Center for Archaeology in Mainz and Kirsty Pankman at the University of York applied amino acid geochronology to protein trapped inside the opercula of freshwater snails from the same deposits. Their result puts the spear horizon at roughly 200,000 years old. Not everyone accepts it. Thomas Terberger, who has worked on the site for years, says he finds the argument interesting, but not yet convincing. If the new date holds, the change is not a technicality. 200,000 years places Schöningen inside the range of the Neanderthals rather than an earlier species, and it hands this arsenal to the population that has spent a century and a half being described as the crude branch of the family. There is a haunting symmetry in that. And there are no human bones at Schöningen. Not one. The identification of who made these weapons rests entirely on a date, which is why moving the date moved the maker. What we are left with is the objects, and they remain the most extraordinary things ever recovered from the Stone Age. Wooden shafts 2.5 meters long, balanced in the front third cut from the hard base of a slow-grown spruce made 3 to 5 kilometers away and carried to a lake where 50 horses were killed and butchered. They are still fragile. Waterlogged wood that has held its shape for 2,000 centuries begins to fail the moment it dries. So the spears sit in a research museum in Schöningen under conditions somebody now has to maintain, indefinitely and hand-on. The lake is gone. The mine is closing. The horses are cataloged bone by bone in a storeroom. And every conversation about the Stone Age that begins with the word simple runs into that shoreline and stops. The tapered point offset from the pith. The weight in the front third. The wood chosen by species and by the part of the trunk it came from. Whoever stood on that lake edge was not making do with a stick. They were building to a specification in a workshop from materials they had gone out and selected 200,000 years before anybody wrote anything down. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.